Where the Arabian desert reaches the sea, the wind brings sandstorms to scour the land. But every year there comes a different wind, which whips up the Indian Ocean and transforms land and sea alike. They call it the Kahreef, the wind of plenty. Behind the southern coast of Oman, bare, rocky hills look out towards the Indian Ocean. This is the other Arabian desert, not rolling sand dunes, but sun-baked stone. It's a harsh and arid place, where water is almost unknown. Few and far between among the parched hills, there are occasional permanent oases, islands of green among the desolation of dusty thorn scrub. In these magical places, tinkling streams water trees and bushes. There's respite here from the heat of the desert, and refreshment for the dusty traveler. White eyes can live here all the year round. Even kingfishers can find a living at the oasis. To a masked weaver, it's a suitable place to build a nest and rear a family. The water comes from underground springs, fed by rain from earlier years. Once every year, near the coast, the Kahreef brings new rain to begin the annual transformation of land and sea. Instead of sandstorms, this wind brings mist. In the space of a few days, the dusty ground is covered with fresh grass. Trees put out their leaves, and dormant flowering plants begin to form buds. The trees trap the moisture in the breeze. The Kahreef is a warm, damp wind sweeping in from the southwest across the Indian Ocean. The mist condenses on the leaves and twigs of the trees, or on the moss on their branches, and from there it drips down to moisten the thirsty ground. The local people are quick to bring out their cattle to feed on the fresh grass. Every year their herds increase, thanks to support from a generous government. And every year they crop the vegetation in a shorter time. Only a rocky sea stack offshore will be untouched. The cattle can't reach it. The low, scrubby vegetation there is as it once was on the mainland, before the cattle became so numerous. From mid-June to mid-September, the Kahreef roars in. It brings wealth to the sea as well. The warm water along the shore is swept away to be replaced by cold water, rich in nutrients, welling up from the depths of the Indian Ocean. The algae in the splash zone, above high tide mark, are fed and watered by the spray. Deeper down, the kelp on the bottom comes to life. Elsewhere on the shores of the Indian Ocean, coral reefs are the norm, but here there's a kelp forest, renewed every year as the cold water comes in. The kelp is a mystery in itself. One species here is new to science, and the nearest relative of another is found only in New Zealand. The third is related to sargassum, the weed which fills the Sargasso Sea in the Atlantic. Deeper down, where the water stays cooler all year round, there's a permanent kelp forest. The fish which live here are camouflaged to match the mottled brown leaves which surround them. A moray eel foraging among the rocks is a potent force in maintaining this camouflage. Any fish that is too conspicuous will be eaten. But even down here, the riches brought by the Kahreef feed new growth. The stage is set for an explosion of marine life later in the year. Crayfish have had a hungry winter, but they will share in the plenty of the coming season. This is the previously unknown kelp. The scientists call it Sargassopsis, which means that it looks a bit like sargassum. Its small round fruit bodies are the means by which it spreads, but not very far. This is the only place where it is known to grow. As the cold waves thunder on the rocky shore, the warm wind which drives them reaches the land as clouds of mist and drizzle. There, the transformation is complete. Where dust and drought held sway, now everything is green, thanks to the magic of the misty Kahreef. But another transformation is beginning. Its agents are goats, the most destructive of all mankind's domestic animals. The flocks here supply milk and meat to their owners and produce some income when they're sold in the towns. But they also supply status, and that's where the problem lies. The flocks are bigger than they need be, and their impact on the vegetation too is unnecessarily hard. As well as the grass, goats eat the leaves and young twigs off the bushes. Eventually they will kill them. At this time of plenty, it's easy to ignore the damage that the goats are doing. The rigors of the dry season are forgotten as welcome drizzle cloaks the hills and awakens the flowers. Small insects attracted to the flowers provide food for rock buntings. They nest twice a year, before and after the season of the Kahreef. The forest most at risk from goats is on the scarp slope above the coastal plain. Before the flocks expanded, this area was practically untouched, but now it's being cleared at an alarming rate. The highest levels of the pasture are traditionally used for cattle. They're fed at night to avoid the biting flies which arrive with the wet weather. By day, the cattle pastures are deserted. Up here, there are old enclosures where once crops were grown every year when the Kahreef arrived. They're abandoned now. Oman has oil to sell and money to import the food which once grew in these fields. Some of the water is temporary, a phenomenon of the wet season. Streams gather along the bottom of the scarp slopes and gush into water holes which are dry at the other end of the year. African silverbills sit out the humid middle part of the day over one such short-lived waterhole. They're not the only Africans in the area. The Jibali people came here from Ethiopia hundreds of years ago. They speak their own language, not Arabic. They brought the cattle and goats with them from Africa. The position of camels here in Oman is rather odd. This was where they were first domesticated by the Arabs. Originally, when they were used as beasts of burden, they were fed on the low-lying pastures near the sea. But today the old order has broken down, and camels are fed wherever they can be driven, often in the vulnerable forests on the escarpment. The damage done by a herd of camels is scarcely repaid by their only remaining function, which is boosting the social standing of their owner. Like goats, they will destroy all the vegetation, turning a forest into an extension of the bare mountains which lie behind the fertile coastal strip. Where freshwater streams reach the coast, they create a unique environment known as a core. It's a freshwater lagoon trapped by the beach which divides it from the sea. The camels come here too, to while away the hottest part of the day. The core provides a feeding place for migrant birds of many kinds. Greater flamingos visit from Africa and Iran during their non-breeding season. Herons come here too, to take advantage of the short-lived abundance of the core. Snipe pass through on migration in the autumn. The Kahreef is nearly over, and the season is once more on the turn. Glossy ibis breed in Africa and Madagascar. They too wander to Arabia in autumn, along with other, more regular migrants, to make use of this temporary supply of food. Small birds like the graceful warbler attract the attention of visiting black kites, whose nearest breeding place is Aden, 1,000 kilometers to the west. Kites are happy to feed on carrion or any small birds or fish that they can catch. Here, on the very margin of the desert, trapped against the sea, there's a complex freshwater fauna supported by the misty rain that came in with the Kahreef. Among the greater flamingos, there are sometimes one or two lesser flamingos. Both species use their long legs to stir the mud, bringing up small trifles to within reach of their filter-feeding bills. By now the core is dwindling in size, and time is running out for many of the birds and other animals that use it. The wind is dropping, and the sea has calmed down, ready for the long, dry season to come. No longer watered and fed by the spray from the waves, the algae in the splash zone have dried up and died. Big changes are taking place underwater too. The kelp is beginning to die as the warmer water returns and the supply of nutrients from the open ocean begins to fail. The deep kelp forest will survive the warm season, but in the shallower water the end is in sight. The dying kelp supports colonies of other plants and animals. Epiphytes growing on the fronds add to the autumnal colors of the whole forest. This time of death is also a time of plenty for animals that can make use of the abundance of plant debris in the water and on the rocks. Abalone, large shellfish, come into their own. So too do the people who make a living fishing for them at this time of year. Abalone are very good to eat and highly saleable in the markets inland. They're regarded as an aphrodisiac, which boosts their price, making abalone fishing a profitable trade. The divers go as deep as 20 meters in search of their prey, without any artificial aids other than goggles and a strong knife. By now, the kelp that feeds the abalone is rotted down to its last stems. The water is as full of food as it will ever be, and shoals of fish come close inshore to share in the feast. The tiny seedlings of next year's forest are already growing. Their growth will be arrested as the water warms up, and they will lie in wait for next year's cold influx with the return of the Kahreef. In the sea, autumn is a time of great abundance. Sea urchins graze on the old kelp, as well as on tiny new plants which are growing on the rocks. Brilliant blue and orange damselfish feed round them on the morsels which the sea urchins dislodge. But above all, it's the time of the filter feeders, worms and anemones which spread their fanciful, multicolored tentacles to reap the harvest of detritus floating past them in the clouded water. Not all the colorful fancies are traps for food. Some are the gills of a gorgeous array of sea slugs, which browse on the decaying stems of the last of the kelp and on the small algae growing on the coral. red-top shell is just one of the sea snails which assemble to join the slugs and worms. A giant planarian worm floats over the food supply like a red flag in a breeze. A bright blue tunicate is another filter feeder from a very different family. It's attended by a tiny goby. The whole vast and varied assembly of animal life is drawn here and fueled by the detritus from the rotting kelp. In deeper water, there are other filter feeders, pale, fragile worms, which can survive only in the less turbulent waters where the surface swell has little effect. Sea urchins take advantage of the supply of food to spawn, converting the energy from the kelp into eggs and sperm to spread their kind throughout the ocean. But a large part of their output will become food for all those filter feeders and for myriads of fish. The fish themselves may fall prey to a lurking stonefish lying in wait on a fan of coral. Coral, both hard and soft, grows along this shore in places where the bottom is not dominated by kelp. The water is clear enough to provide light for coral to grow, and yet full enough of food to satisfy the demand of yet another set of filter feeders. Whatever it does for the land, the Kahreef performs an annual miracle in the inshore waters of this coast. The filter feeders are near the bottom of the food chain. As their populations expand, they provide a reliable source of food for small fish, which are preyed on by larger fish, and so on to the top of the chain. The shoals of larger fish are in their turn preyed on by dolphin, which arrive in schools from the Indian Ocean. The richness of the ocean eventually makes its way ashore by a variety of routes. The most direct link at this level of the food chain is between the dying kelp and animals on shore that eat it. Sooty gulls are first in line for the bounty, picking off the small animals washed up with the kelp. After them come the crabs. The rocky shores are an ideal habitat for Sally Lightfoot crabs, which are so numerous round tropical and subtropical coasts. They're adapted to hang on whatever the state of the sea, and they will eat whatever they can lay their claws on. Washed-up kelp is a nourishing bonus at this autumnal season. The Sally Lightfoots have rivals on the rocks. Rock skippers are small, highly adapted fish which also forage at the edge of the water, sharing the generous supplies of food at the end of the Kahreef. Their front fins are divided to grip the rock like pincers, and the anal fin has hooks to prevent them sliding down into the sea. Cormorants venture into the surf to take their toll of the small inshore fish. Some of them are great cormorants, but most are Socotra cormorants, the species that was hit so badly by the oil spilt into the nearby Persian Gulf during the Gulf War. The Socotra cormorants are the ones with no white on their heads or breasts. In this clean water, rapidly warming as the season changes, the cormorants set off to fish the shallows. The young Socotra cormorants quarrel over the catch. This is not a sign of shortage. Fish are extremely plentiful at this time of year. Along the rocky shore, there are small sandy inlets, which are the scene of a very curious annual event. Rotted kelp, mixed with the sand, makes it very attractive to ghost crabs, another common pan-tropical species. Instead of burrowing, each in its own territory, as they usually do, the crabs crowd together into the richest corners of the beach. Their energetic excavations turn up all sorts of goodies apart from the kelp fragments. Turnstones and a few other waders gather round them to snap up sand fleas, which the crabs unearth but don't eat. Turnstones are universal scavengers, common all round the beaches of the tropics. But there can't be many places where they have their food brought to them by crabs. As the dry season progresses, the core behind the beach is contracting. A thickening mat of algae covers the surface, again supplying food for waders, which pick up the small creatures feeding on it. The algal mat spreads, blanketing the shrinking water surface. The temperature rises, and fish find it hard to breathe. Many of them have died already from lack of oxygen. Only the hardiest species will survive this testing time until the Kahreef returns next year. The harvest is colossal. Using seine nets carried out from the beach, the local people drag in sardines by the ton. The catch along this coast is nearly 100,000 tons a year. Autumn has come to the land. Away from the oases, the trees and bushes are drying up and changing color. The boundary of the desert is extending towards the coast once more, now that the Kahreef is over. Those bushes which have survived the attentions of the goats are dormant, awaiting the return of moisture in the spring. But some plants, like frankincense, rose of the desert, and many acacias, use this time of year to produce flowers in a most unexpected strategy. Like most things in nature, it makes sense when you think about it. Now that the land has dried, these flowers represent the only source of moisture for pollinating insects away from the perpetual oases. Where other flowers go in for seductive scents and sugary nectar, these have only to produce water to bring the pollinators buzzing round their petals. Honey buzzards occasionally pass through Oman on migration in the autumn on their way to Central and Southern Africa, where they will spend the winter. They breed in northern Europe. They feed on the grubs of bees and wasps, as well as beetles and small lizards which they catch on the ground. In spite of their name, they don't eat honey. Once it has removed the grubs, the buzzard discards the empty nest. The magical green mantle laid on the hills by the Kahreef has turned to brown, but the hills are still clothed, albeit in the skeletons of trees and bushes. They are the armor of the hills against the onslaught of summer. The trees, which were so important in collecting the water when the Kahreef came, are now in retreat as the dry season advances. This is the only group of baobabs surviving in Arabia. They may have been introduced by early immigrants from East Africa. There are other trees and shrubs which have adapted to the Arabian environment. Not long ago, this whole area was forested with them, but that was before the cattle became so numerous. Now some parts of the forest survive, but others are reduced to dust at this time of year. Where there are a few plants left, the herds are brought in to look for one last bite before the food disappears. The herds of cattle and the flocks of goats are maintained and enlarged by government subsidy, but no subsidy can replace a forest thousands of years old. The growth of the herds and the destruction of the forests is accelerating, until very soon there will be nothing left, and the desert will have triumphed. From the low-lying plains, which were once their province, the camels have been moved up onto the escarpment, and the cattle have encroached downwards from their traditional high-range lands. The result is plain to see. Cattle trails and the tracks of vehicles crisscross the bare, dusty ground, where the forest cover was continuous only 20 years ago. To see what might have been, one has only to glance over to the inaccessible rock stack, so near to the shore, yet so far from the damage that has been done to the rest of the forest. It is dry, of course, but its shrubs are still intact, their root systems and buds ready to take advantage of the first return of water in spring. Its isolation from the effects of the cattle suggests one way of saving the mainland pastures. Back on the mainland, even at this dusty time of year, unexpectedly in the howling wilderness, the magical oases still offer coolness and shade, and the priceless gift of water. It last rained heavily and continuously in Oman 5,000 years ago. That was when the last pluvial came to an end. A pluvial in this part of the world was very much like an ice age without the ice. During that rainy period, the whole country must have looked like this. Then the water drained gradually away, until in only a few low-lying spots like this was there any left. The birds have been coming here ever since. The dragonflies, the butterflies and wasps probably never left. Nor did the lizards which prey on them. Although the water supply for the oases comes from underground stores, they need to be topped up each year by the rains of the Kahreef. The lives of the residents of the oasis and those of the many migrant visitors which come to use its water depend on the trees of the surrounding forests to gather the mist and drizzle and guide it to earth. As we shall see, this suggests another answer to Oman's problems. The masked weaver has found a mate to come to his nest. He may have built several non-breeding nests during the year, but in the season of the Kahreef he builds to attract a female. When she accepts his invitation to mate, he will finish the nest he is working on, and the pair will settle down to raise a clutch. The weavers can live in Oman only because of the oases, and the oases are here only because of the Kahreef. Kingfishers and white-eyes can breed in this desert country for the same reason. Hoopoes are migrants. They visit Oman only twice a year. But the paradise flycatcher is another resident held here only by the annual magic of the rains. Like all these birds, the purple sunbird is a relic of a once much larger population, leftovers from the days of abundant rainfall. The grey-headed kingfisher hunts small fish and large insects, which are also relics of those old, damper times. Humans may have lived here during the pluvial too, but their impact has only recently had such a severe effect. Now even the last drops of water and sprigs of vegetation are being used up by herds of domestic animals. In the old days, the herds were small. Now they are quite simply too big. When the goats arrive, we can be sure that the death warrant of this oasis has been signed, sealed, and delivered. It's hard to sympathize with a goat herd who tears off the last green leaves to provide a mouthful of food for a few of his flock. No one wants to see traditional ways of life come to an end. The desert economy of the Arab countries has inspired admiration all over the world. But when camels have lost their original purpose and exist only as status symbols for their truck-driving masters, when domestic herds grow far beyond the capacity of the land to support them, the time has come to rethink. And in Oman, people are thinking very carefully. No one is short of money to buy the amenities of the 20th century, but equally no amount of money will change the climate. There must be a way to reconcile a modern way of life with an environment so fragile and complex. The government supplies water, pumped from wells reaching deep into ancient underground aquifers, stores of water whose life must be finite. Most of the water which nature supplies every year in the Kahreef goes to waste, because the trees which used to collect it have gone. So what is to be done? Here's one suggestion: metal trees. The function of the trees is taken over by wire mesh screens, which trap and drop the moisture in the same way, if less elegantly. The tanks hold enough to supply water to plantations where new trees are being grown, eventually to be planted out in areas which will be protected from grazing and browsing animals. After only a couple of years, the difference between overgrazed and ungrazed land is easy to see, just as it was on the rocky pinnacle offshore. When goats leave them alone, the twigs bear buds, ready for the coming of the next Kahreef. It will be a slow job, but there is a way forward for this remarkable country and its spectacular climatic cycle. Before too long, when the storm clouds gather and the wind gradually gets up in May, the Kahreef will return to a land which will once more be able to make use of the generosity of the bringer of harvest, the wind of plenty.
And next Friday at 8, The Shadow of the Whale looks at how the eruption of Krakatoa affected wildlife.